neuroscientists have done all the pieces of jigsaw. Very few people seem to be trying to do the jigsaw till it reaches people. There's going to be a few more generations miss out. And that's terribly sad. I see people struggling all the time. I feel guilt because what I know, what I've put pieced together, could transform their lives. You know, when I heard of people depressed, when I see people in the street because they haven't got enough intellect to get themselves a job, all of this stuff could help that. You know, people are only misunderstood because they're kind of eccentric, they're odd because of the way they're developed. They're not choosing to be like that. If I lose my temper or I lose my intelligence, lose my emotional control, it's because I've run out of mental capacity.
Winfred, I want to say welcome to This Anthro Life. Really, really excited to have you on the podcast today. And you know, the kind of big areas that we explore in this podcast is kind of human potential, right? Like, what can we do as a species around things like culture and technology and the human experience? And I think one of the most important areas, both for kids and as adults, and then even as we enter into senior ages, is the capacity of learning, right? And what our brain does as we try to learn new ideas. And so, I'm excited to talk with you, particularly because I think you've done a lot of really, really fascinating work over the years around these areas of neuroplasticity and how we learn, especially with learning challenges, things like dyslexia, ADHD. And so I think we're at a really exciting time, in both research and where we are. And I hope societally, like thinking about what education can be and how learning can happen. So I want to dive into all that. But first, just want to say thanks for joining me on the program and great to have you today.
Oh, thanks for what you're doing to give hope and point your headlight into corners that people don't normally have a look at. So thank you.
So I think to kind of open us up into the space, then I'd love to get a bit about your own. We can talk about kind of superhero origin story, right? Like, what kind of found your way into this space? I know you have a personal tale that is harrowing, but I think really important to kind of think about what does it mean to change direction in life, right? So I'm curious, like, how you found yourself coming into this space around learning and neuroplasticity.
I was up in the north of England one day, a long way from home, and I got that phone call that any parent would dread to get. And it was from my younger daughter saying, my older daughter had attempted to take her life. She was in hospital. The doctors were desperately trying to save her. And you can imagine, I was simply driving along, totally focused on something else, and this hit me like a bombshell. And all sorts of questions were going through my mind, but by that time, my daughter had rushed back to the bedside and put the phone down. So I knew where the hospital was. I'd got a 2-hour drive. And on that drive, you can imagine what was going through my mind. The questions like, have I done everything I could? So on the outside, people saw me as quotes, very successful, several businesses, very profitable, lots of nice cars, a plane at the airport and a boat in the marina and all of that stuff. What they didn't see was the fact that I'd got one child couldn't learn, 4 children, all the same amazing teachers at the same school, and one couldn't learn. The other 3 did. So obviously I am a researcher, so you can imagine I took her to all of the experts. The best she got was she's got to learn to live with it. And here suddenly she told the world what I'm suffering with isn't worth living with. So I went over all of the things that I could have tried and I didn't because I ruled them out, and there was kind of guilt and all sorts going on. And on the way I realized that my life had been fun, but it had no real purpose. And suddenly it was as if the universe was giving me a purpose. And what I vowed to do was that if Susie lived, I would change my career, I would sell my businesses, and I would focus on why it was that Susie couldn't learn. And as I pulled up at the hospital, my younger daughter she knew roughly when I'd be there. She was outside waiting for me, and she was saying, "Dad, I think they're going to save her. She seems to be coming round." Sure enough, she did. She did come round, and she's alive and well and happy to this day.
Awesome.
Which is incredible. But my life had changed. It took me quite a few months, a couple of years, to finally get rid of the businesses that I'd built up from scratch. Then I didn't know where to start. It was, where do you start? The world is
Yeah.
looking for solutions like this, and yet the best of the solutions that were available was not finding Susie's potential.
Hmm.
So I don't know how spiritual you are, Adam, but
Hmm.
I've become a lot more spiritual because I realized the universe took me down.
Hmm.
So it took me down an exciting path. I started meeting neuroscientists that were
Hmm.
amazing. Neuroscientists that I don't know how best to describe it. Probably they were making wonderful pieces of jigsaw about how
Hmm.
the brain operates. And yet nobody was doing the jigsaw.
Interesting.
So I went round all of these researchers at Harvard Medical School and Sheffield University and various other places, and I started doing a jigsaw. And then it became kind of increasingly clear why it was that there was this big void. We've got psychologists who are great at understanding why we do things and what our motivations are. There's psychiatrists who seem to be brilliant at prescribing medication when there's things going wrong. There's educationalists who are very good at teaching. But in the middle, there's this void.
Hmm.
You can't learn if you can't take information in. Whose job is that? Into which
Hmm.
discipline does that fall? And I seem to be forever in that vacuum in between other disciplines. But because my research, I developed all sorts of technology that today would have been used on the World Trade Centers if they were putting it up.
Hmm.
It's incredible. So I'd done all sorts of clever stuff. I started an examination board, which became the fastest growing awarding body in Britain.
Hmm.
I own some scores. I've done lots of things, and it's always at cutting edge. And so the skill I had at putting together stuff that was at cutting edge was now serving me well. It was as if the universe had prepared me for
Hmm.
doing this.
Yeah.
And fortunately, all these amazing neuroscientists were all wanting to help.
Yeah.
And they are to this day. They're gathering around now. They are wonderful people. And because I don't have to wait for the normal restrictions that apply to research, I don't have to wait for ethics committee approval. I don't have to wait for funding to do mad research that no one else can get the money to proceed with. If I get a mad idea from a professor that no one else has tried, I can try it. And that's what I did. And it wasn't many months before Susie was making progress. And it wasn't many months before I was getting a queue at the door of the clinic I opened, because there were so many others saying, hey, my child's struggling with attention, with ADHD, with reading, with concentration, with organization, and so on. And then I got into, of course, the whole topic of neurodiversity. So there's my backstory, Adam. That's how I was pushed to time to rewrite.
No, that's great. I appreciate you sharing that. And it's funny. I remember years ago I came across this definition of spirituality that has always stuck with me. I mean, this is like, I think I found it 20 years ago now, but it's just this simple idea that the spirituality is kind of like the learning to read the signs in our own lives.
Yeah.
And speaking of learning, right, in this space, and kind of like, how do we see what's around us a bit differently, right? And like what might be kind of helping guide some of those pathways. And an interesting kind of way to explore this too. I mean, even the questions around what our mind can do and like how society helps or doesn't help that, right? I think it's one of these important questions that oftentimes, and I think you nailed a really important area where it's like, if we're in a gap between disciplinary silos, right? If we're like, there's not a, like, how do I take information in? And right now, neurodiversity is a more common term that we hear people talk about. It's interesting because we see it both, in schools and also workplaces too. Where we kind of the rise of thinking about neurodiversity. I'm curious, like in this space too, as you're learning to read the signs, of your life and the directions that we might go in. It's interesting to kind of note that like you found your way kind of into this middle space, right? Where there was the power of science to kind of like get in and dissect an idea, right? And
Yep.
neuroscientist A is working on this piece of the puzzle, neuroscientist B is working on this piece of the puzzle. And you kind of said, well, what if we put those together? Is that kind of how it happened? Were you kind of thinking, I guess, like synthetically, like let's bring together a bunch of the different pieces of research that are jumping out to me?
When you're a dad that's desperate to save your daughter's life, you actually ignore protocol. You're simply desperately focused. You don't want another phone call like the one I had when I was up north. So those early days were kind of frantic. I ended up with 400 staff researching,
Wow.
often with going in all sorts of different directions. But what became very clear very quickly was there were kind of mental constraints. People, they assumed that whatever we were born with between our ears, we have to live with that. And I was saying, no, we don't have to. And that was kind of optimism at the beginning, but it wasn't long before it became reality, because before the neuroscience was saying, no, there are things we can do. We joke about the fact we only use 10% of our brain. We actually use kind of all of it, but all of it is capable of enormous numbers of new synapses, new connections. If we do the right things to make those new connections, we actually increase our intelligence. We increase our mental capacity. And nothing I was seeing in any of the medical disciplines had this concept as a possibility. With physical health, we know we can do exercise to get stronger. We can eat properly to be healthier. But with mental health, it's always, what's the best coping strategy? Let's assume that it's a problem, and what can we do to minimize that problem? Nobody ever thinks, what do we do to increase mental strength, mental capacity, mental resilience? And all of those things are possible. And that's why I started to get kind of belligerent in my pursuit of, how do I make Susie's brain stronger? How do I increase her mental capacity? So, that journey has taken me 25 years so far, and we've got some incredible things happening. But the neuroscience that's come out, particularly this last 15 years, has all been reinforcing and adding momentum to the possibility that we can change our mental capacity, which has impact in almost every area of our lives. And it's that concept that I really want to get across, Adam. People just don't believe it. Doctors don't believe it. They're not taught at medical school you can increase capacity. So we've probably got another generation that aren't going to benefit very much from what neuroscientists have known for at least 20 years now.
Wow. We need to get on that then, right? We need to help change that story and that message then.
Well, you're the man.
Right. That's what we're here for, right? So that's fascinating too, because so that makes me immediately think, there's kind of two areas, I guess, both kind of, one, we could think about them sort of on different spectrums of the lifespan, right? There's usually like kids learning to learn. And then there's seniors and folks, like we talk about cognitive decline now, right? And so these are kind of two areas that just pop up as we think about ideas of like mental capacity. Is like, I'm imagining, but like, did you kind of begin thinking about it on like the younger person learning side and then expand?
My initial focus was on reading difficulties.
Okay. Yeah.
Because because I'm an entrepreneur, I know loads of entrepreneurs who actually don't read for pleasure. They can read, sort of. Some of them can't read. Most of them can, but most of them don't read very well. So they went right through school, not doing very well in exams. I own a couple of private schools, so I'm entitled to speak about this. I'm a big fan of teachers, but what teachers do and what the education resources aim for is making you good at regurgitation. The whole exam system is helping you be a good regurgitator and measuring how much you regurgitate. So you could be incredibly creative, think outside the box, solve problems at breakneck speed, be hyper-focused when you want to, probably be unfocused when you're not excited, and so on. Schools don't measure that. So the people who are very bright go through their life with this preconceived notion, didn't do very well at school, can't be very bright. Then they go on to become millionaires because they run businesses. Or they end up in prison because they blah, blah, blah. So, it's a big gamble, but we do know that the typical entrepreneur has high levels of ADHD in the main, and that school focused on the negative symptoms of that rather than on the upside. So this whole subject of neurodiversity was where I first started. I first started with, quotes, dyslexia. Then I realized that 1 in 4 people in the world don't read as easily as they should. The present methods, which are focusing on phonics, work great up to the age of 7, but beyond that, it's not more phonics that you need. It's good eye tracking and good processing speed. And that's what I worked on getting. So as I looked more into reading difficulties, I realized that the overlap between attention deficit and reading struggles was huge, and nobody was talking about that. So ADHD is big and getting bigger, and
Yeah.
yet probably 80% of those with ADHD symptoms don't find reading easy. So I
Yep.
started looking into all that, and it wasn't long before we were finding natural ways of continuing the development of key parts of the brain to keep all of the upsides of neurodiversity, but lose
Hmm.
the limitation, the downsides.
Yeah.
It's the downsides that most people focus on.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that was my start, and it was a huge surprise to me. We thought, yeah, this will work up to maybe 16, because by then neuroplasticity is going right down, and you can't make fundamental changes after teenage. And then we got folk in our 20s pleading with us, please
Mm.
let me try your program. Oh, it works. And then somebody in their 40s, and there's somebody in their 60s, and I was giving a talk one day in the south of England, and an old lady of 82 came up to me and she said, please, can I do your program? And I started to explain why I wasn't sure if it was going to do any good. And she said, let me try. I get hurt every day because I can't do what everybody else finds simple. So I let her do it, and she was on breakfast television on Britain 4 months later, holding up the first letter she'd written in her life. And then 2 years later,
Wow.
her daughter rang me because her daughter had put her son through the program. He was autistic, and she wanted to tell me how exciting that was going. And she said, oh, do you remember Liz? I said, yeah, how is she? She's 84 and she's reading and writing in 3 languages. So that was a huge breakthrough for me. So suddenly we realized, instead of just focusing on children, we were developing the neuroplasticity. Now nature says the very exercises we get people to do multiplies stem cells in the key junction boxes of the brain, in the cerebellum and the hippocampus. When you create more stem cells, you increase the density of gray matter. You make the whole brain work better. My focus has always been actually on the cerebellum, because cerebellum's only small. It's only 10% of the volume, but it's actually 3/4 of all our brain cells. You put stem cells into that, Adam, and you increase the number of connections in that, and suddenly all of your brain is going to perform better.
Wow.
And that was the essence of what we're doing. So I'm now working with a university. We're going to do some studies showing that before and after fMRI pictures showing this is the transformation that is possible.
Now, when you're saying that too, is it the idea of doing certain exercises can also have a stem cell like? It's funny that our phones are doing this, right? Have stem cell like sort of increase in neuroplasticity, or is it like actually also adding stem cells to the brain?
It's doing both. When you combine 2 different types of exercise, and that is, you have to have stimulation to the vestibular system. That seems to power up the cerebellum, which, if you remember, is 3/4 of all our brain cells. So
that's crazy.
There has to be a balance. And this was work by Jeremy Schmalman, a professor from Harvard Medical School, an amazing guy. His work will change the world. I simply hope he gets the credit for it, because he's been saying this now for 25 or more years. So when you stimulate the vestibular system doing balance exercises, and you then challenge the cerebellum to do something it's not used to doing, if you do the right combination of those, you increase the number of stem cells. And Nature, fantastic research paper showing exactly that. You multiply stem cells if you combine those 2 types of exercise. Well, I've been working with exactly that combination of exercises for 25 years with over 50,000 people. So you can imagine we've got an awful lot of research data showing what you do with what brain at what stage of development to take it to the next stage of development. And so I started off, just to answer your question more fully, I started off with children, and it wasn't long before I realized adults could also be impacted. But the secret that we applied was that if you can increase neuroplasticity at any age. And if you can do that, you can make fundamental change. So we started to blow out of the window this concept that whatever you were in teenage was pretty well the shape of your personality and character. We think of character as it's usually judged by what we are very good at and what we are not very good at, what our limitations are. That is determined by the cerebellum. Cerebellum's a bit like a room full of computer coders. And different parts of the cerebellum are responsible for developing different types of skill. So if you're neurodiverse, you're a bit eccentric. I was reading a story the other day about a poor guy who was very, very autistic, but his ability, he could just listen to any complicated piece of music and play it. But if you asked him to dress, he couldn't wash himself or do up his shirt buttons or anything like that. So hugely eccentric. That's what happens when you get the cerebellum distorted in its development. And effectively what we're doing is doing an audit on where is there scope for more development. In other words, where is there potential? And then we focus on developing that part of the cerebellum. People always use very lightly and very carefully, oh, he's got huge potential. They never tell you where it is. We know it's hiding in the cerebellum. They never tell you how to develop it. We know you've got to create neuroplasticity and then challenge the cerebellum in a specific way to develop the very bit of the brain that makes the vital connections, that gives you your skills, gives you your competence, gives us your mental capacity and strength.
That's such a fascinating thing to think about too, because it, if we think, this will sound weird, but back to the like Rene Descartes idea that like there's the mind and body split, right? It's like, it seems in this level that no, that they actually, like, the mind body must work together for having a form of kind of physical exercise for the vestibular system, and then bringing that into the mental capacity around the cerebellum. I think it's always one of those interesting questions of like, when you think about when we philosophically split something up, sort of what does that do to shape obviously our thinking and our approach? And I wonder how things like that filtered into our educational system, right? And then now we're kind of saying, actually, we need to be a little more holistic in our approach and how they work together.
My dream would be that in my lifetime, as quickly as possible, the education system extends beyond how do we provide excellent teaching, because the quality of teaching in the Western world is generally pretty awesome. But how do we extend that responsibility so that instead of just educating, we look at the ability to take in information and retain it and recall it and use it? Because it's those with neurodiversity, it's like having a superb computer that's plugged into a year 2000 modem, probably 56K. So you have a powerful computer with very poor in-out. When you meet people who are shy, it's because the cerebellum hasn't developed their verbal fluency. When you meet people who can't listen for long periods, it's because the cerebellum hasn't developed their auditory processing. When you look at people, find people who are physically clumsy, then you're talking about balance and coordination that hasn't been perfectly developed by the cerebellum. Or the same is true as of emotional control or social skills or whatever type of skill it is. Whatever limitations we have, I'm not very good at dancing. Whatever limitations we have are because the cerebellum hasn't developed that kind of skill, so it becomes automatic and I become a natural at it. So the very concept now that we need to revisit our whole understanding of what are limitations and start assuming there are things we can break through those glass ceilings to increase our performance in whatever, to increase our mental capacity. Because when we do that, our confidence goes up. We start to feel on top. So, my early work didn't take long before sportsmen were coming to us saying, hey, I want to have greater precision and consistency in this, because that's what the cerebellum does. So that's the genesis of where I was at. Today, of course, we're spending a lot more effort looking at stress and anxiety and mental overload, because particularly since lockdowns, the number of people, the number of adults, the number of children in school. So my work now, you could summarize it as I am looking at ways of increasing mental capacity across the board.
That's fascinating too, to think about that. On the one hand, there is the traditional pathway of educational systems, right? That kind of that both can do well, but then have a limitation in terms of what they will focus on, beyond something like phonetics, right? But then also to this point, that when we have also other kinds of external changes, things like the pandemic, right, or lockdowns, that has really changed the people's stress and overload levels, and even things like there's discussions around things like long COVID, right, where there can be brain fog for extended periods of time that we're still not even sure both how it happens. Maybe maybe it's in the cerebellum, and then like what do we do with that in that space?
Convinced it's in the cerebellum. He's absolutely convinced it's in the cerebellum. Sorry, Callum.
No, yeah, but I think that's I think that's kind of where I was going to with that. I think there's like an interesting point that, you know, it's one of those things, like the brain has been with us forever, like as at least as long as we're anatomically modern humans, right? But then for 250, 300,000 years, but then beyond that too, like we're just now beginning to kind of peel back those layers of how it functions, right? And very interesting to realize that like a very tiny part of our brain actually may have one of the biggest points of genesis for you know, both how we learn and operate in the world in total, right?
Absolutely. Well, coming back to the education system, teachers are not given the tools to find out whether a child has got any limitation in his or her ability to read, to focus.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah,
you know, we could teach them some things in just a few minutes. So if someone holds their pen in such a way that when they write, their whole hand moves, that is a gross motor skill.
Mm-hmm.
It means that their fine motor skills are not as developed. So if the normal way of writing is with your fingertips, so the pen moves, and that's fine motor, and the whole hand doesn't move. If you're using that, it's the gross motor. Well, the same part of the brain that controls fingertip controls eye movement. So you could teach in 30 seconds. You look out for those children that have got some strange grip and using their whole hand. They have got huge potential. And guess what? When they're reading, it's hard work. And if you take a video of them, their eye movement when they read, you can see their eyes going all over the place. Sometimes their eyes aren't even moving together. So the brain has to do a huge amount of work just to see and work out what the letters and words are before they start to be able to fathom out and comprehend what's being said. So that's one little trick that anybody could be taught. In teacher training school, they have, if they're lucky, half a day on special needs, on neurodiversity, in other words. So they're taught to teach brilliantly, and they do. They're not taught to find out what is the developmental gaps in that child that's stopping them achieving their full potential. So they're not given the tools to assess. They're told quite a lot about phonics, and phonics is critical, but beyond the age of 7, it's almost harmful. But they're given the tools to look at the development. And I think that's where education needs to go, because generally, the brighter you are, the more likely it is that you're going to show up with some sort of reading limitation or concentration limitation. So I'm sure you've got a few billionaire friends. You ask them, how much do you read for pleasure? It's probably not a lot. And did you finish college and school? Possibly not, because many of them didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got an education right now, an education system that is not delivering the brightest and best children that it possibly could. So it's down to families. And you get warrior mums and warrior dads who saying, I'm going to take responsibility. So they're digging this stuff out. Will another generation be lost before this actually filters its way down into our school system? Who knows?
That's a fascinating question. And I think it's really important too, because it raises, I think, a fundamental point of or question of like, what is the purpose of education, right? And I mean, you know, it's one of those things on the one hand that, you know, a common Western traditional education system is basically like modeled after Henry Ford's factory system. Right. It's like, it's here to like, it's rote learning, to your point. Like we saw before, it's like remembering facts, right? Or then, and phonics and things like that. But then when it comes to questions like critical thinking, those are questioned in college, right? And they're often questioned by people saying, do you even need to go to college too, right? And like, that's a huge miss, I think, on that space. And so I think this really interesting piece. I like the example of the gross motor skills versus kind of fine motor skills relationship to eyes, and kind of there are physiological aspects like that we can monitor with folks to kind of get a sense of how they engage and learn. And
there's a big argument about ADHD. Some people even to this day argue, oh, it's just naughty children. No, it's not. Children have not got a choice.
Yeah.
And when we do the neurological tests on them, we can show what is happening when they try and focus on something. And they are working hard. You can see all of the activity in the brain going bananas, just trying to focus. Those that can focus, it's smooth and effortless. Those with ADHD, it's not effortless. They're not choosing to be naughty. They're not choosing to be bored. They're not choosing
Mm-hmm.
to think outside the box and get into trouble because they're coming up with an innovative solution. All of the things that what is wanted in business is what ADHD folk very often show very often. But
Yeah.
they're written off in the school system because, understandably, teachers can't control 30 children if 6 of them are off the wall, bouncing off the walls. I understand the problem.
Yeah.
But we need to find ways of recognizing when
Mm-hmm.
there's hidden potential and what we do about it, because it's transformational. What we're seeing now is that children in the bottom quartile of the class, often they deserve to be in the top quartile of the class. And
Mm-hmm.
when you continue and complete the development of their cerebellum, that's often where they end up.
Yeah.
But I want to just take a step back into where do all of these problems come from? What are the things that initiate? What is it that stunts the development of the cerebellum in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've turned my research focus to this last 4 years, Adam. And what I'm seeing more clearly than ever is that all elements of neurodiversity start with trauma.
Mm.
Sometimes it's trauma during pregnancy. Sometimes it's trauma at birth. The cord is around the child's neck or forceps are needed. Sometimes it's trauma in the early months. It's always before the age of 7. But if someone has significant ADHD symptoms or struggling with reading, in almost every case, it's fairly easy to find there was a trauma that stunted the development of the cerebellum. So this trauma in the early stages can cause 3 things. 1, it can stunt the development of the cerebellum.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, it can create triggers. In other words, it can create a propensity for high levels of stress and anxiety throughout life. So it kind of sets the thermostat. The world is not a very safe place. And therefore, you're glass half empty and you go through life responding worse than you should to every slightly different or slightly risky situation. So if 2 soldiers go to war, one had a very stable, very carefully nurtured childhood, and another one had some traumas in his or her early childhood, and they go through war in the same regiment, facing the same issues. The one that had the difficulties in early childhood will come back with PTSD. That's a generalization, of course, but I'm just saying that early propensity is like the thermostat is set to expect high levels of problems, throw out lots of cortisol whenever anything goes wrong that you can't make sense of. So that's the second thing.
Got it. Yeah.
The third thing can create genius.
Oh, interesting.
So you look at many of the genii we know around the world that make exceptional breakthroughs in life. Often they had very traumatic childhood. Now, if there was nobody around to support them, they can become victims. So of that third one, they can either be genius or they can become victim. And it takes an awful lot of changing if they go down the victim route. So the 3 things are: trauma in early childhood can stunt the development of the cerebellum. That can create signs of neurodiversity. The second one is it can create triggers, which pushes the stress levels and the likelihood of anxiety right up. And the third is it can create a victim or it can create a genius. So that's the impact. That's how early traumas determine the outcome of our lives. So in studying this last few years, I've been looking at a 2-pronged approach to dealing with that. First of all, you have to develop the cerebellum so that the brain can learn, can develop, can grow, can make vital new connections. But the second thing you've got to do is get rid of those initial triggers. So if someone's got anxiety or serious stress, most people assume that's life. They've got to put up with it. Some, it's so bad that they go and get some meditation to help them cope with it. But there is another way. And what I've been working on is helping people use tools like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That's been proven for the last 30 years to be one of the best tools to overcome the root cause of anxiety. It kind of unplugs the original trauma from the alarm system that causes hypervigilance and stress and anxiety and plugs it back into a regular memory so you can remember it, but it doesn't have that effect. Well, when you combine tools like EMDR with high levels of neuroplasticity, it seems to be 10xing the
Wow.
impact it has.
Hmm.
So I've been playing with that because if you can do that and you can develop the cerebellum, you take away the two main limitations that we have in mankind that holds back our development of our mental capacity. So
Wow.
that's the fun stuff I'm up to at the minute.
No, that sounds super fun. Yeah, I love this idea too of like how can we think of and draw from the best tools that both have been around for a little while, but that like that neuroscience is helping prove out, right? And EMDR is a really interesting example there too of that. Because I've heard about this like in relationship to psychedelic like assisted psychotherapy, right? As another pathway of like combining both EMDR and therapeutic use of psychedelics. And
Yeah.
it's an interesting idea too of that of like because part of it too is this idea of like how do we detach like a root cause experience of trauma from like a reflection of it, right? And not always like trigger the same experience that like blocks us from moving out of that traumatic space, kind of mentally or emotionally, right? Yeah.
Well, mental limitations affect us in so many ways. Obviously it affects our performance. If reading is hard, I don't take in much information by reading. If listening for long periods is exhausting, then my thinking brain is going to be full of stuff that shouldn't be there. So if you take a child that's struggling, doesn't read very well, doesn't concentrate very well, because those skills are not fully developed, they're not happening up here in the cortex. Some of it is happening here in the thinking brain, in the prefrontal cortex. This is where our mental capacity is. So any underdevelopment of reading, of listening, spatial awareness, so on and so on, fills this up. And this is where our executive functions are. So attention goes out the window. Impulsivity is a possibility. Inhibitory control is not there. Emotional control isn't there. Some of our memory functions are impaired. So all of the symptoms we see in ADHD are explained by overload in the prefrontal cortex. So there's some great medication which dumbs the brain down, and people need that just to cope sometimes. But there is another way, and that is to work on the cerebellum and find out why those skills have not developed. Deal with that. It frees up this space here, and a few things happen. You start to have your executive functions back, which is fantastic. You have more mental capacity, and the more mental capacity you have, the more confidence you have, the more on top you feel, the happier you are. So there's all sorts of fascinating byproducts that we're watching and collecting data on right now.
And also, I mean, with that too, I think you said something else really important that we, on the one hand, have a pretty common, especially in the West, a pretty common pharmaceutical culture, right? Like they kind of throw a pill at a problem. But you're kind of noting here that there's another pathway that involves this kind of like focusing in the right area and then like doing some exercise work and thinking around that. And like, I'm curious, like your thoughts on this in terms of like, there's the kind of pluses and minuses we've seen of the education system, but I think another side of it too is this, the kind of, I'm not sure if it's medicalization, but just this idea that like we've been pushing a lot of like sort of pharmaceutical interventions versus other kinds of pathways. Do you kind of resistance in terms of like, we're trying to take an alternative pathway here, or has it been?
When I thought I was curing, in the early days of my clinic work, I thought I was curing something, curing dyslexia, and maybe even curing ADHD. And some documentaries went out that said that.
Huh.
One day I sat down, I thought, I'm actually not curing anything. All I'm doing is completing development. All I'm doing is exposing the potential that's always been there. I'm not doing anything clever. I'm just driving the development so that the wiring gets finished off.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so, why isn't this exploding the way it should? Well, there's a big problem. We need drug companies because we often, most people at some point will need some medication. Not against that at all. But this is an intervention that nobody will make a load of money out of. Because it involves stimulatory exercises, coordinated stimulatory exercises that anybody can do anywhere, and they do it for a few months, and it permanently changes their cerebellum, and that permanently changes their competencies, their mental capacity, and their emotional controls. Nobody's going to make much money out of that. So if nobody can justify, we've got to spend $1 million on this to develop this product, because we're going to make billions, if nobody can see that as a possibility, they ain't going to happen. That isn't going to happen. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
everyday solutions out there that aren't being invested in, aren't seeing the light of day, because everyone has got access to the pharmacies and the medication that you can get from there. But I'm not knocking that. I'm just saying, when people become aware that there are ways of dealing with the root cause of mental limitations, we will change our attitude to what our mental capacity is, what our performance could be, what our
Mhm.
emotional strength could be.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great point too, because it's, if you think about it too, like again, like I also agree. Like I know we need medicines, and they're actually quite vital for many people's lives. And part of that too, I mean, is this idea too. But you see, thinking again, this notion we were kind of saying before of like, typically when we see mental health as a concept, we think about it as like a deficit model, right? That like, how do I cope with an issue, right?
Yeah.
And it seems a bit reflected also in on the one hand how we like approach medicine a little bit. Like, again, I'm not here to knock medicine either, but just like, just the interesting notion of like, I am taking this to then help myself focus, or I'm taking this to either get rid of a headache, but then kind of thinking about like, if we have a capacity approach to the question, how might that change how we approach what we're doing, right? And exercise is an interesting way to think about that, because like, I don't think about, if I want to go run or lift weights, I'm not like, I have a strength deficit. I don't approach exercise that way, I could, I guess, but
I have to be careful because I got so much respect for the medical profession. I've
yeah,
got so
yep,
much respect for teachers, and I started irritating teachers early on, and I didn't mean to. I run some schools, so I have to be very careful around that. I love them to. So finally, I had to learn to explain to them, look, you're brilliant at putting a fire hose of input into these buckets that you're teaching at
hmm
school, but you're no
yeah,
good at repairing the holes in the bucket. So if the
mm,
ability to retain information isn't there, and the same is true of stress and anxiety. We have to have psychiatrists who give out medication to help people just survive through the day sometimes.
yeah,
But if they could spend 10 minutes a day exercising the very part of the brain that can develop and connect better the rest of the brain, they can turn that mental fragility into strength. And with
mm,
mental strength and mental capacity, you get mental resilience. It isn't as quick as taking a pill. It can take a few weeks
yeah,
or months, but it can be transformative. So,
hmm
so thinking in terms of, should I invest 10 minutes a day for the next 3 months to transform my mental capacity? I think it's a really good
yeah,
idea.
hmm yeah. It's going to say that metaphorically, it feels like a no-brainer. Right? But yes, I mean, so let's talk about some of these exercises. Like, are they specified? Like, how do you? I guess how can we? Yeah, what maybe give some examples of what they might be in terms of like, if is there certain kinds for ADHD versus dyslexia, for example, for age groups? Like, how do we approach that?
We started off looking down exactly that track, but we very quickly realized that the limitations in the cerebellum were independent of the symptoms that were manifest.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
we started off by doing the classical measurements of auditory processing capacity, visual processing capacity, processing speed, focus and attention, and so on. So we started with all those measures. And, when you work with 50,000 people, you've got access to 50,000 different brains, and we've
Hmm.
all got different brains. So we eventually were able to work out what type of stimulation, what level of stimulation for how long is appropriate to get this person started. And
Hmm.
then we built into the system collecting data every day about how they responded to that. And we put AI into it so that every day we could adjust the type of exercise, the level of stimulation, and so on. So that we took them on a rapidly progressing journey of building up the density of gray matter in the cerebellum and let that do the job that it's supposed to do,
Hmm.
which is to do an audit on all of our skills, find out our limitations, and increase the precision, the accuracy, the consistency of our performance of every type of skill. When that
Hmm.
happened, it freed up space in the prefrontal cortex. Our executive functions work better.
Hmm.
We don't start from symptoms. We start from neurological measures of how well is the cerebellum performing right now, because that gives us a clue about where in the cerebellum we need to direct stimulation, and all of that stimulation comes from carefully chosen exercises they do for 7 to 8 minutes a day. And they're all delivered these days on on a phone, so you can do it at home. You can do it. You don't have to go to clinics anymore. It can be all done on the phone. So we've created some tools that are very powerful, very well used. So we know the outcomes. They're safe and they get results. Today, it's not just applying to neurodiversity, it's applying to the root cause of our stress, of our anxiety symptoms, of our mental overload, of phobias even.
I mean, that's really interesting and nice to know too, that it's recognizing that if we're starting from a similar point of what our cerebellum is doing, understanding like where it is developed, underdeveloped in different folks, and the measures. So that's interesting. So like that being said, if one can do them on their smartphone or at home, then like does the kind of neurological indicator test, how does that happen? Do folks take it online? Do they have to go to a clinic for that one? Like, how does that work?
We've got two levels. We've got the professional version. You go to clinics to do it, but the vast majority do the light version, because that works just as well. Do that on their smartphone, and in it is built all of the classic neurological tests. We built them into fun games. They only take a few minutes. So every 4 weeks, people are going through the program. They get a measure. How is my brain performing now? Is it increasing its capacity? And if so, are my symptoms in everyday life also responding and reacting positively as well? So we get this neurological development and what's happening in my life, and you can marry those up and just see the progress. The wonderful thing about the cerebellum is that when you change it, it's permanent.
That is nice.
When I learned to ride a bike, I didn't know. I knew what to do. I was thinking about it, but I was falling off. Eventually, the cerebellum worked out what I should be doing and created an automatic program, so I didn't have to think. The minute I didn't have to think, I could ride my bike. So that was, the cerebellum did the job, and instead of me thinking about it, it was all happening up here in the cortex. But when I got to 17 and I bought my first car, I put my bike in the shed, forgot about it for 20 years.
Yeah.
I got it out after 20 years because my stomach was growing and I wanted to be fitter. I pumped up the tires and I had got the skills. So if I to remember how to spell your surname, in 20 years, I might well have forgot it, Adam. But that's because it's the hippocampus. The cerebellum gives you permanent skills, permanent concepts and knowledge that doesn't go away. So that's the wonderful thing about what is now possible. Thanks to neuroscience, we can now make lasting changes to the very characteristics that have been limiting us. And the impact it has on life, it's not just performance, it's relationships, it's confidence, it's happiness. When we've got more mental capacity, we are on top. We are happier. When our thinking brain is full of stuff, coping with lack of development of key skills and key concepts, that's when we feel low. That's when we're likely to be depressed.
Yeah, I know. I mean, and that totally and I think that most of us can relate to that, especially during the pandemic, right? Of just having that feeling of overload, right? And I mean, like, and you hear it too, just, I mean, especially like in American business discourse, right? That people are burnt out, students are burnt out, right? Like, I imagine it's probably the same in Britain too. And just that, there's just this like constant, we're doing too much and it's like, we're all stuck here, right? In the front part of our brains. And we don't recognize like that's where we're sitting often, right? It's I guess very cool to realize too, that like development in the cerebellum space is not something that happened as a kid and then you're done. Like your teeth came in, that's it. It's that, but it's a process that can be kind of re-upped, right? And kind of and fixed. And like that's like it's a nice breath of fresh air to realize that both as we get older, as we age, like we can find ways to both deal with past traumas, like I think in really interesting ways like this, that neuroscience has kind of opened the doors for us to recognize there's new pathways. Yeah.
Neuroscientists have done all the pieces of jigsaw.
Yeah.
Very few people seem to be trying to do the jigsaw till it reaches people. At the present rate, there's going to be a few more generations miss out. And that's terribly sad.
Yeah.
Terribly,
it is.
Terribly sad. I see people struggling all the time. I feel guilt because what I know, what I've pieced together could transform their lives. When I heard of people depressed, when I see people in the street because they haven't got enough intellect to get themselves a job and all of that stuff. When I see people falling out in relationships because they're misunderstood,
Mm-hmm.
All of this stuff could help that. People are only misunderstood because they're kind of eccentric, they're odd because of the way they're developed. They're not choosing to be like that, yet people assume they're choosing to be like that. If I lose my temper or I lose my intelligence, lose my emotional control, it's because I've run out of mental capacity. And when you transform mental capacity, you transform the behavior of people. They are happier. They do fit in better. They are more understood. In my schools, I often bump into children that are misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
And that hurts me because they go through the life traumatized by the very experience in school. It doesn't happen in my schools, by the way, but teachers are too careful for that. But it happens all too often. And I'm not blaming teachers. They are not given the education. They're not the training to understand the very developmental process that causes the manifestation of all of those symptoms that are hard to put up with, hard to cope with.
Yeah. And again, I think it helps us think that, how can we set up mechanisms in society, things like what's happening in an educational institution or school is about that. And it's interesting because, there are things like the Waldorf school in Montessori, right, that are taking alternative capacities right through the learning. And so I'm curious, like, I suspect there could be some appetite minimally around there versus like getting a more traditional school to kind of be able to think through some of these ideas of like, I liked your metaphor of like, you can put a lot of information or water into a bucket, but then if it gets a hole, we can't keep it, right? And that's an interesting idea of like, and I think too, especially as we're talking about helping students, but I mean like helping also teachers not be overloaded, I think would be hugely important, right?
Yeah.
They have one of the hardest jobs on the planet and one of the most important ones,
When you look at all of the public servants, the police force, the stress levels they face, soldiers going to war and coming back from war, often they're kind of abandoned because they've seen the worst atrocities. They've come back with all sorts of traumas, and there's no solution for many of them. I want to reach as many as possible. I want to reach those kids that have gone through school traumatized because they had some symptoms of neurodiversity and were misunderstood, and they came out with poor scores because the exams only measure regurgitation, and yet they face the crossroads. Are they going to be hugely successful like some, or are they going to go through life dreadfully underachieving like many others? We have got the tools to change the way we approach all of these important things.
I would agree.
The health service is grossly overstretched, overstressed right now. They just can't get enough. Then the level of anxiety in schools, the level of anxiety in adults is huge. We don't have a mental health process capable of dealing. I'm a board member of the Reach Institute, which is an American institute that gets training and so on to doctors at the front line of children that are stressed at school. The problem is massive. The problem is absolutely massive. Well, I think we've got a hint here of something. If we can piece it together, that in the next very few years, we could transform at the most fundamental level mental capacity that would make such an enormous difference to millions of lives.
Yeah, I think it's super exciting, and I'm suspecting at this point, listeners and audience folks are kind of saying, "Hey, this sounds like a really interesting piece." So, if folks want to learn more about this, we can check out your websites. But where should they go to kind of learn a bit more about the science and the programs?
The website's got a lot of information on it. It's Zing Performance, ZING Performance.com. There's a lot more information there. And I'm always answering people. I've got a team that answers people with specific inquiries. So you reach out. There's ways of reaching out in that. But look at zingperformance.com. There's a lot more science there, a lot more research papers you can look at, because you want to, some will want to check out what I'm saying has got.
Yeah, let's verify, right?
It's behind it. And I always encourage that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that too, because I mean, I like both as a fellow researcher, right? It's important to do two things, right? And that's one is to cite your work and figure out like where your grounding is. The second is what we're also having a conversation around here too, is like, what does it mean to socialize research, right, and make it accessible to other people? Because that's like one of the biggest challenges too. Is like I like nature and cell in biology, but I'm not a hardcore scientist, and it's difficult for me to read a neuroscience paper. Maybe because I'm an anthropologist. That's my deficiency, right? But Yeah.
Well, look, I've been very blessed. A professor took an interest in me, Professor Rod Nicholson. He's currently at Edinburgh University in England. He became my mentor 25 years ago, and he's helped me in an unbelievable way. First of all, he understands the long words and I don't, but I've
Mm.
got the mad ability to put connections together. I
Yeah.
can break the rules, to check things out. I never take risks with people, but I don't have to wait for all of the approvals and the funding that university professors generally have to. So I've been able to accelerate this process,
Mm.
apply it to tens of thousands of people, so we collect enormous amounts of data so that the process becomes safe. I think there's more exciting breakthroughs to come.
Mm.
Folk want to benefit now. If folk are struggling now and existing interventions hasn't helped them with their anxiety, with their limitations in concentration or ADHD symptoms or reading difficulties, have a look. I would love to help.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Winfred, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's been great to talk with you. And I'm super enthused to think about like neuroplasticity as a new pathway that it's available to all of us. And like the frontiers or the doors are just opening, right, to be able to explore what this can actually be. So thank you for doing the work that you're doing and taking the risks.
And thank you. You could just save it being too many generations before this reaches everybody. Thank you,
Yeah.
Adam.
Yeah. That's the dream. Awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure. Cheers.